Welcome everyone. This is Melanie Schmidt with Timpano Consulting. Delighted to have our crew of advisors back together again, talking about the variety of things ahead of us now as we are continuing to navigate COVID-19. And I am with Timpano Consulting, and I have the opportunity to be a strategy partner for organizations to help them figure out how to move forward and move beyond business as usual. So with us on the call, we have Kate Serpe with Wegner CPAs. We also have Darian Luckett with IFF, a community development financial institution, Jim McNulty with Oak Bank, Mindy Rowland with Spark LLC, and Melissa Scholz with Scholz Nonprofit Law. My great appreciation to all of our advisors for joining us today, and to all of you for participating on this call. Also, as you know, wanted to create a space for us to do a bit of quick centering here as we move into our questions. So today the quote is from Albert Einstein: "Wisdom is not a product of schooling, but of the lifelong attempt to acquire it." And the last 2 months have certainly felt like a lifetime. So thanks for everyone being in this learning community as we continue to work to acquire some knowledge. So we've been talking a lot about the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, and the opportunities that exist for businesses and nonprofits. And Darian, wanted to turn to you first and just get your perspective in terms of that opportunity for nonprofits with the PPP. It's still out there. What are you offering? What's the guidance that you would share other than what we have been saying? If you've been thinking about it, do it. Do it now.
Exactly.
Take it away.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. My name is Darian Luckett, Director of Lending for Wisconsin for IFF. What I've encountered over the last 6 weeks or so has really been thoroughly immersed in working with nonprofit organizations throughout Wisconsin, Iowa, and even a few helping out some of my counterparts in Ohio. What I've seen over the last few weeks, things have slowed down in terms of the number of applications that's come through. We're trying to get our hands on, trying to get our finger on the pulse of how much dollars are remaining. And I'm going to say it's going somewhere upward between 100 million, maybe 105 million as of last Friday. And I would say, things have slowed down only because, most of the small businesses were able to get in. Well, some of the larger small businesses got gobbled up all the money the first go around, but then the second go around, we think that we saw that the dollars were a lot smaller than the first go around. So those dollars have stretched out a lot more. I believe our organization, we got into the process and applications on the tail end of the first round. And so we partnered with the organization called CRF in order to help us reach the nonprofit community. And we in the second round, we have done upwards to about 150 to 200 applications that's gotten approved. And so, we're really happy that we're able to reach out throughout the Midwest and help out that many organizations. All I can say is if you have not applied, it's not too late until, I guess, the money runs out or there's a hard deadline. I'm not 100% sure, but I would say, give it a try. You really can't lose anything. But one thing I can say now is, as you would probably hear, I think everyone that's been processing applications are probably a little bit more smarter than we first start, because it was so much of a moving target that now I think we're able to, the borrowers are probably going to be a lot more informed and be able to, make a good decision on if this program is really for you all or for them, and how does the mechanics of it work. So I'm here to let you know if you have questions about applying the process or whatnot. That's the part that I'll be playing, and being able to jump in wherever I see fit as my other teammates talk about some of the other mechanics on the back end if you receive a PPP. Thanks a lot.
I did just launch a poll for everyone, just to get a sense for those of you who are with us today in terms of where does your organization stand in terms of the PPP, whether you have your funding, you're awaiting disbursements, you're still being in process, working through the application, don't know how to apply, or if you aren't pursuing it at all. So we'll give folks a little bit of time to work through that poll and provide that information. Right now, it looks like for a lot of people with us today, they have their funding or they aren't pursuing the PPP. So encourage those of you who are out there, give us that feedback through the poll of where you stand, and know that information that we're sharing today, encourage you as well to share that with others, particularly if you're just hearing someone who's still talking about should I or shouldn't I. Make sure that they know that there are opportunities still available. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll in 3, 2, 1. And with about 75% of our folks responding, looks like we are talking primarily with folks today who have their funding or who aren't pursuing the PPP. So we'll look for opportunities to provide some insight in terms of the forgiveness aspects as well as what to do now, and then also look to spend time in terms of the workforce reentry and some of the other aspects about navigating COVID-19. So thank you for participating in that poll. Jim McNulty, if we might turn to you and just again get your perspective from Oak Bank. I know the community banks in general have had an incredible response to this and continue to hear really positive feedback about that and about Oak Bank. So what would you add into what Darian was sharing and the rest of the perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely echo a lot of what Darian said. The first wave was, tidal-like, tsunami-like. The second wave was active right out of the gate for people who are waiting. And there's still activity, but it definitely has slowed down quite a bit. All of the activity, or most of it now, has been, waiting for the initial forgiveness guidance coming out, and now people just starting to absorb what came out over the weekend for forgiveness. And it will be another big wave of actually applying for that and continuing to advise people. So we're just trying to get up to speed on that as soon as we can. But there you go.
Great, thank you. Which is the perfect segue, Kate. You have been digesting a lot about the forgiveness and the application, and obviously preparing for your own company's webinars coming up. What's the thumbnail? What are the key points that you would encourage people to take away?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been an interesting last few months. Like Melanie said, I'm a senior manager at Wegner CPAs, and I took the lead when this first rolled out a few months ago at our firm, in learning as much as I could about it so that I could be available to help my clients, and then realized how much there was to digest. So I wanted to be sure that we had a resource to help all of our clients and some of our non-clients. I've spent a lot of time talking to clients and non-clients, and I think the most important takeaway that I've seen over the last few months is just ensuring that, organizations, businesses have thought about, I think, what the true intent of the loan program was, and really utilizing it for exactly that. I mean, those are the rules. There are specific things you can use it for. And just make sure that they're staying in line with what the guidance is, and keeping up with webinars like these and asking questions, legal, bankers, accountants, whatever resources you have access to, just making sure you're staying in touch with people, because there are a lot of ways that businesses and organizations that maybe don't have a financial background, there are a lot of ways that something could slip by. So documentation is huge. I'm an accountant, so documentation is always huge. But in this, there are no bounds to the amount of documentation I would recommend you keep. And just, stay on top of the news. There are things coming out. It literally has been daily. Changes, knowing what resources to be looking for. Every day I start my day going to a couple of different websites to see if anything's been updated. So reaching out to those that know what those resources are, so that you can put those on your kind of daily reminder to-do list. And then just continue to ask questions. I don't think there's a single bad question in this scenario, because it was a lot to digest. I'm lucky enough that I've been able to digest most of it, I think, but just to continue asking questions and know that there is still money left. And if you need it, don't be afraid to apply for it. There's been a lot of, I don't want to say scare tactics. I think some of the information that came out was necessary, but I think it's important to if you need it at all, to be applying for it. And the deadline was originally June 30th. Now, if things have slowed down so substantially that people haven't used all the funds by June 30th, who knows what would happen, but that was the original due date of the application is June 30th. So
I just wanted to ask Kate a question in terms of what she's seen. We had a lot, or not a lot, but I've talked to a number of organizations that were worried about applying because of the certification requirement that to say that they, that because of economic uncertainty. And then of course, last week or the week before, whatever, they came out with the guidance on the safe harbor, that if the loan is less than $2 million, you can assume it's was necessary. Mm-hmm. And so do you feel like there's people or organizations still out there that are contemplating that because they feel like it's not justified? And
I think so. I mean, I still have continued to get questions from people that have either gotten the funds and they are just literally afraid to use them, or they know that there are funds available and just don't know how to get past that certification. I think
so, and I know most people on this call have PPP, but I do find that those of you that can reach out to your colleagues and some of the smaller organizations, we helped someone the other day, would get $2,000 or $3,000. And I mean, that it was pretty overwhelming for them to try to do that. And yet they're really grateful for the $3,000. So if you've done it and can, coach someone else, perhaps we can reach more of the groups that really haven't taken advantage of it yet.
Definitely. I think it's important to note. Yeah. And I think it's important to note, that safe harbor, I think, was really important to calm people's fears. But I think we also, what I have strived to make sure that people know is that there is still potential that there are going to be follow-up questions. Just because your loan is under $2 million doesn't mean that the SBA isn't going to ask you for more documentation, or the feds aren't going to come back to you and say that they want to audit the use of your loan. So it's important to note that, yes, that safe harbor is there. And so it's helpful for those that were feeling nervous about having, a loan that was maybe $50,000 or maybe it was $500,000 to get them past that May 18th payback date. But there are still potential audit possibilities in the future. They certainly have not said that we aren't going to audit anybody. So those things are always still there, which again is why I always go back to documentation. You can never do enough of it. Those are just the facts. So I did sit on a webcast that was put on by the AICPA, which is our accounting governing board. And there was a gentleman from a large firm out on the East Coast that I thought made a really great recommendation for those that were feeling overly concerned about that certification, and just as good practice in general, that for your documentation around that certification, to just have a memo in place as to why you felt you needed that, why you expected the economic downturn to impact your business or organization negatively. I mean, I would say that at least 98% of the people that applied made that certification in good faith. Nobody had any idea what was going to happen.
That's really been my point, is that if you're looking not to what you have in the bank right now, but it's so realistic that there are going to, sorry to say, but there are going to be problems for a while to come. Right. And so, but to your point, putting that in a memo, and just because you have an endowment fund or some reserve doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer economically. And of course, you can't tap the endowment fund for the most part. So,
And Jim, I wonder if we might turn to you in the conversation for kind of a few aspects of what we've just been talking about, and also what a question that came in advance, which seems similar to one that you've been responding to in the chat about. There's this whole notion of can we return funds? What if we got more funds than are going to be forgiven? How do we deal with giving them back or paying them off without overcomplicating or losing out or just making a bad move?
Right. Obviously, still a lot of uncertainty out there. If you just get to the point, like one of the questions in the chat, where you get to the end of your 8 weeks, you haven't spent or comfortably spent a lot of the money, you can just call your bank and pay the loan off. It has accrued interest. That interest likely isn't going to be forgiven because you're not applying for forgiveness, but it's at 1%. So it's likely a modest amount of money. If you just don't want to deal with it, you pay it off and move on. So that's something. We also had a couple of clients that did take the safe harbor, and we paid that off with no interest. So, but that period has passed. But we did go through that exercise with a lot of clients who are nervous, as been discussed. But what's out there is discussion and discussion only at the SBA of, are we going to extend the period where people can spend their money? I'd probably flip a coin right now, 50-50, whether there's going to be some substantial rule changes. What generally happens with these types of programs is they set the rules, they look like they're in stone. All of a sudden, people start applying for forgiveness. Good, reasonable people aren't getting forgiveness. They're calling their congresspeople and screaming and saying, this is not working. And quickly, some rules and adaptations start coming through. So it's likely going to be, the phrase the SBA has literally used countless times as they're building this airplane as it's flying. The forgiveness rules, while not, it looks like a nice complete forgiveness document currently, it's got a lot of detail. There will almost certainly be some changes. That may well be one of them, some more grace, because again, people have been stuck with this decision. We are closed. Do I spend all of this money paying people when they aren't doing anything right now, which is great, but there's so much uncertainty on forgiveness. Do I do that, or can I somehow spend this when we are actually now open? Big question, but there will likely be some pretty active discussion over the next month on that exact period. So,
Jim, can I weigh in and ask a follow-up question? I get questions from my clients about, I got more money than I need. Mm-hmm. What should I do with it? And I've been suggesting, you've got three options. One is see it as a 1% loan and figure out something else to do with it. Mm-hmm. Pay that portion back, as soon as the loan becomes due. But then the third is try harder to find something to do with the money. I'm wondering if it seems that some of the guidelines even now are flexing a little bit as far as the money when it's incurred during the 8-week period, or perhaps when the bill becomes due during the 8-week period. I'm wondering how much flexibility you're seeing, or that you predict that we'll see in that regard.
Yeah, well, I'll have Kate echo after I talk, but I was pleased with the forgiveness document. All the questions were: is this cash? Is this accrual? What if my payroll is outside of my 8-week period? They did what I would consider, at least first review, as a pretty good job of saying, if your payroll period starts a little after and goes a little after your 8-week period, or if the bill for electricity, is incurred, but you don't have to pay it as long as you pay it before the next cycle. So there's some decent grace in there. So you really should, even if there's a bill that's a little outside or a little before your 8-week period, look really hard. They gave what looks to be some common sense grace there to do what the right thing is when you've got spending in this 8-week period, to have a little bit of flex before and after, based on when the money's either being spent by cash or being incurred, especially on the payroll side, since that's when it is. They gave some good flexibility there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that I think it definitely clarified a few things. Honestly, I was expecting to see a little bit more out of the forgiveness documentation, just because there's been so much buildup to when are we going to get this, and I almost felt a little let down because I felt like I kind of knew most of what was in there already. I was excited to learn more, and I don't think I learned as much as I thought I was going to. One thing, just to speak to Mindy, what you just said, the one thing I would caution, and I am not in the business of lending money, I'm not a lawyer, but from my reading, I don't believe that this money, even if it's not forgiven, can be used for any other purposes besides the eligible costs. Even if you go beyond that 8-week period, or there's a portion that isn't forgiven that you haven't used. In all of the certifications that were made on the original application, it indicates that you're using the money for the eligible purposes. That's the certification you made when you actually applied for the loan. I haven't seen anything that indicates that if, let's say you got a $100,000 loan and you only needed $50,000 to cover your costs in that 8-week period, that $50,000 doesn't essentially turn into a working capital loan. It's still a loan that you have to use for the eligible payroll and non-payroll costs. Now that's my interpretation out of all my reading that I've been doing the last few months. Certainly if anybody else feels differently, I'd love to hear more about that, but that's from my reading and my understanding based on the certifications that were made on the original application. So I just want to caution.
Yeah, I think it's an important point and an important caution, because I think there has been also so much anxiety just in these times, but also then around the uncertainties of what's happening, that depending upon how people hear things or process them in terms of finding additional ways to use that money, it's important that it is knowing, we're saying find ways to use the money within what's allowed, and not having that being misinterpreted as just going out and doing something important for their organization, but outside the parameters of the forgiveness or the PPP.
Yeah, and not losing sight of the fact that it's called the Paycheck Protection Program,
Exactly.
right? To keep people employed.
Right.
And, we're definitely hearing, I know this, I see one of the questions online about their period running out June 9th. I certainly hope that there's some resolution on this if they're going to extend the 8-week period, because that's the thing I'm hearing the most that is likely to happen in some bipartisan way, is to perhaps extend the 8 weeks. So
yeah, there is a new bill that's out that's working its way through Congress that's called the HEROES Act, and that's like the fourth bill that would come to play. In what I've read and what I've heard, the expectation is that that's not going to pass for a while, which is unfortunate. And there is some additional guidance that was added to that bill about the PPP. It's not adding money to it. It's simply clarifying and allowing for some extend the period of time you could use it. And there are a few other things, but it's likely not to pass for a while.
So we have a couple questions here. I see that's something I was just going to bring up on this bonus hazard pay issue. And we've gotten a number of those questions for people, who came back to work in essential capacities at nonprofits, frontline services, in human services, et cetera. And our answer has been that, as long as the compensation stays still in the reasonable range, there aren't huge fluctuations, and that you've documented the justification for that, the risk that they've experienced, the extra staffing they've helped you provide, whatever, that we think, there's some flexibility there. But curious what you're saying. Kate?
That was one of the items in the loan forgiveness that I think it did not specify that hazard pay or bonuses were not eligible. And there is a section in the actual forgiveness calculation itself that if you calculate in calculating the percent wage reduction, if you did have to cut anybody's salaries or hourly wage, there's a section in the wage reduction calculation that states that if the average pay over the 8-week period is greater than the average pay over the first 3 months of the year, then you're fine. You don't have to move on to the next step. So that kind of indicates to me, I think, in a subtle way, that certainly if you are able to pay people more than you were before, I don't see that there's going to be any issue with a bonus or some sort of hazard or hero pay in addition to their normal salary. But I agree with Melissa that it needs to be reasonable. You know, if you typically issue bonuses once a year and it's at the end of the year, I think you're going to have a hard time justifying issuing that entire bonus over in that 8-week period. But if you're issuing a portion of it that's relationally related to that 8-week period, I think you're going to be fine. So I think you have to weigh a lot of different things when it comes to paying people additional. I would also say that you have to think about the FTE calculations. So even if you have the ability to pay people more, that's great. But have you also had to cut staff? If you haven't rehired those staff or rehired new staff, or you don't fall into some of those safe harbor rules, then you're going to have an issue with forgiveness anyway. So just because you're paying the people you've retained more doesn't mean it's going to be 100% forgivable if you haven't actually gotten your full-time equivalent count back up to where it needed to be related to those prior periods that you're comparing to. So,
and I would also weigh in to keep in mind you've got your $100,000 cap. Right. So if you're bonusing people, it's not a free for all, because there is only so much money that you can hand out to certain employees, and at that point, after the $100,000 number, you're capped off anyway. So don't go paying your top people $50,000 bonuses by any stretch.
Well, and it seems that, you know, when we are getting into this, and that's the, I think, particular challenge with things not building the airplane while it's in flight, is that at a time when so many organizations are having to move beyond business as usual, think about doing things differently. In fact, it seems that a good practice would be to be operating within the same sort of norms when it comes to your payroll that you would normally have been doing. Is that, I mean, I'm just sort of processing out loud, because I think, you know, there's this panic that is also in there in terms of, all right, now I've got funding through this Paycheck Protection Program. It's going to help me. I'm worried about what's going to be happening, not just within these 8 weeks, but potentially balance of year into 2021. So if you start as a decision maker, all of a sudden changing how you issue payroll, changing your bonus structures, changing how the money flows through your company, would that not be risky at the same time when it comes to having to defend use of the funds?
I think, yeah.
I think overthinking things yet again.
No, again, you know, what Kate said is exactly right. You know, there's nothing that says you can't pay bonuses, can't pay hazard pay. It's payroll. But if you pay half of your people 50% more, you know, either your payroll is going to be a lot higher than it was before, and if you can afford that, great, or you've cut some headcount to make up for that, and then you've got an FTE problem. So it really will come out in the math and kind of get down to, I think what you said, Melanie, is basically this program wanted you to continue paying people about the same amount of people, about the same amount of people as you were before. I've told 1 million people, it's kind of like the PPP made you and your bank an unemployment agency for this period of time, where you were continuing to pay people like you were before, even if the business didn't necessarily justify it and you would have made some other decisions.
And I would piggyback on that too. What I've been telling people is that, because I think it's very frustrating for employers to have this cash and to have to pay it out, even if their workers aren't working as much or not working at all. There's something that feels icky about it, especially when you know you're going to want that money come July, but there's only so much time to use it. And so what I've been trying to convey and to kind of ease that tension and that anxiety about it is, you're basically a conduit to figure out a way to get money into people's hands, get money back into the economy. And this is one way we've figured out how to do it. So don't think of it as your money. Just think of it, you're just the funnel getting the money from point A to point B. And it just so happens that you're lucky enough that you get to choose that the money that's out there that's being handed out, your employees are the ones who get it, as opposed to, you know, the general populace. Because otherwise I do think it causes a lot of, it doesn't feel right if you're paying these people to not work. And so you kind of have to change the cube in your thinking a little bit, like what Jim said, is because otherwise you're going to get caught up in, why am I paying people for not working?
Absolutely. And another question has come in that speaks to something that we've been talking about, and I know is a question that's been out there prior to this conversation as well, and that is the full-time equivalence calculation. And Kate, I don't know if that's something that you would be the right person to provide some insight, in terms of the belief that most of the time you're considered full-time at 30 hours, PPP loans saying 40. What should that calculation be looking like for people?
So it wasn't until the loan forgiveness application came out that we actually had an answer for how the PPP was going to calculate the FTEs. The only guidance we had before was related to another credit that came out as part of the CARES Act. The employee retention credit had referenced an IRS ruling that stated that anything over 30 hours was considered one FTE. But obviously with the new loan forgiveness calculation worksheet, we know that they have now identified 40 hours as being the equivalent of one FTE. So it does, excuse me, it does give a little bit of flexibility in how to calculate the FTE in that it is still based on 40 hours, but you can use a simplified method by just stating that anybody that works 40 hours or more is one FTE, and anybody that works an average of less than 40 hours is 0.5. So if you have, 200 employees and you don't want to go through and calculate what their average, what they work on an average week over the 8-week period versus, there are about, 5 different periods that you would have to go through and calculate, again, by employee. This is not an overall, this is by individual employee. So for somebody with 5 employees, I say, do both calculations and figure out what's most advantageous. If you have 200 employees, I hope that that there's a really great spreadsheet that we can soon pass out that people can just filter information into, but it's still a matter of collecting all that information. If you're great about timesheets and you've got a lot of hourly employees, it may not be that difficult, but it's also a lot of tedious work. So, you're either going to be doing a lot of math, or you're going to make it easy for yourself and you're going to say, I have 50 employees that work 40 hours or more on average, and I'm going to call them 1, and everybody else, the other 50 employees I have are going to be 0.5. Or you can actually go through and do all the math, but it is dividing now by 40. So 40 hours a week is one full-time equivalent. So there isn't anything above 1. 1 is the max. So 40 hours and above, if somebody works 60 hours a week on average, they are 1 full-time equivalent employee. If they work 80 hours a week, they're still 1 full-time equivalent employee. I hope nobody's doing that. But anything under 40 hours, the simplified method, you call them 0.5 FTE, or you can go through and do all the math and it rounds to the 10th. So you could have 5 employees that are a 0.8 FTE and 5 employees that are a 0.2 FTE. Again, it's a lot of math. So it depends kind of on how much math you want to do and how much you want to be forgiven, because you can do all the math and make it the most advantageous for you when it comes to forgiveness.
So I think there are two questions that come to mind with that. And one has to do with organizations who have union contracts in place. And what if that union contract specifies a full-time as 37 and a half or 37 or some number other than 40? Is that then it just comes down to doing a lot of math? Any thoughts on that, Jim or Kate?
Jim is muted.
Sorry. Yep. I think Kate can verify, because I probably haven't dug into this quite as deep as her, but I don't want people to get too hung up on what anyone's definition was previously. It's really a comparison. What have you done for the 8 weeks versus what did you look like before? So you're going to have to calculate previous FTEs during a period and compare it to make sure you didn't reduce. So when you look at your previous, you're just counting as 40 before. You don't have to recount and change that sort of thing. Kate, is that how you're seeing it? You're really comparing it to a previous period, and as long as you count an FTE as a 40-hour person in both periods, then you're comparing apples to apples.
Yes. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, you're going to have to, if you have an employee that works, you have a part-time employee that typically works an average of 20 hours a week. I don't think you're going to have to go back and recalculate in that prior period, did they actually work at least 20 hours a week? If you have a contract with them that says they work 20 hours a week, they're a 0.5, FTE. And if they still worked 20 hours a week over that 8-week period, they're a 0.5 FTE. I think that if you didn't have any reductions, if you didn't lay anybody off, or it was very minimal, there is that simplified method that you can use that's going to make it really easy, where you can either say 1 or 0.5 and move on from it. I think the issue is going to come in with people that had to do a lot of layoffs. They have a lot of hourly staff, or they reduced their salary staff down to 80% time or 50% time. And you are going to have to start doing some calculations, because you, at least for the 8-week period, but also, right now, one of the comparative periods actually falls a little bit into, the period where people might have started doing layoffs. So I think there's actually a lot of math involved. I wish it was a little bit easier, but there's a lot of math and a lot of comparison. I do want to just address, I'm seeing a couple of, a question about how, what was used to calculate the loan amount. So on the application itself. So I just want to clarify that on the application itself, and Jim, you can probably speak to this too. So there wasn't an FTE calculation on the actual application itself. There was a question about number of employees, and that was strictly related to like head count. How many employees do you have? Not how many FTEs do you have? So that number that was put on the original SBA application for the PPP loan didn't have anything to do with full-time equivalents. So you aren't comparing that number to anything. That was strictly how many employees do you have, be it part-time, seasonal, full-time. That's what that number was on the application, which was not clear at all. But that is what it was. It was not an FTE calculation at all. So.
Yeah, and I don't want to say almost ignore what number you put on there, but that to me was more than SBA tracking. How many jobs, the SBA loves to track how many jobs are touched by their programs. They wanted to be able to say, and so did us as bankers, to say we've helped 10,000 people working at companies right now. But for this forgiveness, it's much more of a math calculation, like Kate said. What exactly, according to this measurement, did you have before? What did you then have during your 8-week period? How do those two compare? And if they're close, then you'll get good forgiveness. If you dropped a lot comparing the two, then you may not be fully forgiven.
Right.
It strikes me that this is almost a classic case of value in capturing your current state at the time you submitted your application, and then capturing your current state at the time you're submitting your forgiveness application, and seeing how those two are matching up to one another to tell your story. And because isn't that part of what we're trying to do, is to see what's changed or what's been maintained in terms of our workforce status and our paycheck amounts from then to now, so that essentially the math can get really, really complicated and fearful and overwhelming for a lot of folks who don't live in that land on a daily basis or love Excel spreadsheets as much as I know that some of you on this call today do. So just trying to frame it potentially a little bit differently to help alleviate some of that anxiety about it just being overwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. And again, the accounting friends were definitely involved with the first wave, but a little more consulting and needing to take a back seat because it was banker. But this forgiveness round, there's going to get to know your accountant friends and people good at spreadsheets, because that will be a very helpful resource. The bank, again, you'll submit it to us. We will then submit it to the SBA, make sure your documentation is good. But folks that are good at the accounting side and spreadsheets are going to be helpful for this, for sure.
Yes, definitely. Continue to build those relationships and reach out if you feel like you need a better relationship. I think it's similar to what we were saying the first time around on the application side. If you're not getting the support and the assistance that you need, there are a lot of qualified individuals out there who are capable and willing to help you move that through. I'm going to do a quick switch for a little bit, and I'm going to launch a new poll in terms of thinking about restoring the workplace, because that was another component of what we wanted to get to today. And we have about 10 minutes or so left in our planned time together. So just curious, when you think about the current status for restoring your workplace, where are you sitting? Are you ready to implement your plan that's in place? Are you in the midst of figuring out your new norms, researching your options, trying to figure out where to start? Doesn't matter, we're business as usual or something else. So take a moment to respond to that poll. And while you're doing that, potentially Mindy, turning to you and saying, with all of the things that are happening, guidance that's coming out, top level recommendations that you would share with people, or any considerations that should be top of mind for our organizational leaders.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. We're in a tough space here in the state of Wisconsin. Last week we heard from our Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they kind of threw everything upside down and left a lot of organizations in a little bit of a tailspin, trying to figure out when to open, how to open, because for a small period of time, at least in Dane County, there were no rules at all. Dane County very quickly put out an order, as did several other counties, putting some safe measures in place and talking about reopening guidelines. But there's also a question as to whether or not those guidelines are enforceable too. So businesses are really in between a rock and a hard place, trying to figure out what to do and know whether they can open. I have spent quite a bit of time looking at the forward Dane. I mean, I'm pretty Dane County centric. So if you're outside of Dane County, forgive me for a second, because I'm gonna focus mostly on that. And they do have a lot of resources, as does the WEDC, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, have some really, really good guidelines on how to open up, things you should be considering, including forms, sample, don't forget to wash your hands signs that could go up. So there's some really good resources out there. If you're in the midst of starting to reopen and figuring out what your plan is, I would start with those two. I would look up Forward Dane and use all of those resources, and then take a look at the WEDC site as well, because they are giving some very handy how-to toolkits, guides on different ways to think about it and how to implement some of these return to work. And I hesitate saying return to work, right? Because lots of people are already working, and whether you're working from home or whether you've been essential and working the whole time, I don't want to discount the people that have already been working, but kind of the reopening of the workspace in general, that concept. So those are some good resources to look to. A lot of people have questions regarding, should I be monitoring my employees' time off work? Are they practicing social distancing? Are they headed to the beach and hanging out with 25 of their best friends? In Wisconsin, if the activity is lawful, you can't make employment decisions based on an employee's off-duty lawful behavior. So then the question gets to, is it lawful? Is their activity lawful? I saw on Facebook, somebody showed me some picture of something that said X. So now I'm in a position to start monitoring my employees' off-work conduct. And can I do that? Should I do that? I would advise to be very, very careful about doing that from a picking and choosing standpoint, making some assumptions standpoint, and just being real careful, because we are pretty tight here in Wisconsin about not making employment decisions based on what people are doing off hours. Now, that said, if somebody shows up at work and they're coughing and they have a fever and they're sick, you certainly have the right to question what they were up to and if they've been in contact with people who may have the virus, and you can send them home, absolutely. But that's not what I'm talking about in this instance. So that's one of the big questions that comes up, Melanie, as people are trying to figure out how to monitor their employees.
Yeah, and that's similar to a question that came in to me, and I had no response because it's not my area. I said, you need to go talk with someone else. But it was the situation of someone who had lost a family member, and they wanted to go to a funeral. The funeral was going to be held. It was held out of state. They were going to have to fly. They were going to be in close quarters. There would not be social distancing involved. is whether or not, as an employer, they had the ability to require that individual to self-quarantine or to not come into the workplace for a period of time, so that if anything, there was psychological comfort for them.
Yeah, the employer has the ability to say you need to stay home. If the person can work from home, that's great. But frankly, even if they can't work from home, the employer does still have the right. They are entitled to tell people not to come to work and not pay them if they're not working. They could offer PTO. They could pay them. They could do various different things. They may fall under the Families First Act and get some paid leave as a result. But they definitely have the right to say stay home. The balance that employers are going to have right now is they will need to balance the need to keep all their employees safe versus one employee's need, want, desire, own health. And so there are guidelines. Employers have an obligation. On a federal level, it's OSHA, but on a state level, we've got a Safe Place Act that requires employers to keep their workplace safe. And so when you look at it through the lens of, I'm not just worried about you, I'm worried about everybody, some of those answers start to settle in and make a little bit more sense.
Yeah, Mindy, I thought that the forward Dane guidance, I'm looking at page 9 right now, does a good job of reminding that these things really do need to be written down and implemented. And, you can't just take for granted because you think everyone's been wearing masks or that everyone knows about, the 6 feet of distance, and just doesn't have to be fancy, but they do need to be written and shared with everyone and, available and enforced.
Absolutely. And you, as your workplace, you have the right to dictate what goes on in your workplace, right? You can require that your employees wash their hands every hour. You can require that somebody is in charge of wiping down all the doorknobs. You can require that they wear masks. Can you require that they wear masks outside of the workplace when they're off hours? Probably not. But you can require within the confines of your workplace those different rules. And Melissa, you're right. I mean, I don't mean to be dismissive, but putting up signs saying, here's how to wash your hands, here's 20 seconds. Those things, for a lot of people, it seems so obvious because we've been dealing with it. And I've been telling people how to do this for months now. But people who have been staying home and have been focused on taking care of their kids for the last 2.5 months, for example, they're not thinking about what does 6 feet look like. And maybe I shouldn't be bringing my coffee and sticking it in the break room fridge. And if we've got people working from home, maybe I can open up one of those offices so I actually have additional break room areas to actually spread people out. All those different things that come into play that you want to start thinking about. It's not second nature. And so the more signs you can put up, the more you can write down. So I've got some clients who are having their employees sign agreement saying, I agree that I'm going to do the following things. And I know this is important. And for me to come back to work, I will do these things. And just to really hit home how important it is that you do have control over your workplace and doing what you need to do, because you do have an obligation to keep that workplace safe.
And I think that's a really important point as well, because while on this call and from other conversations that we've had, we know that we believe these things to be important, but not everyone does. And so that's also something to remember as we're thinking about the importance of the documentation and the communication. But Melissa, to your point, the consistent enforcement of those workplace norms and procedures, because when it's written down and communicated clearly and consistently, there can be fewer questions about what the expectations are, and that the employer has the right to say, I want you to do this. This is what our workplace is going to look like, because everyone is in agreement on how everything should be handled. And so I think that can also be an important leveler. I want to do another quick question because it's come up, and then we'll need to wrap up the official part of this, is looking at, Mindy, again, thinking about PPP funding coming in, but also people taking PTO, and anything that you can advise in terms of that relationship or requirements that employers can or can't do in terms of using PTO while PPP funding is in play.
Well, I'm going to go back to what Jim and Kate were saying, in that the whole purpose of the PPP loan is to fund payroll, right? I mean, it's the payroll protection program. And so if you keep in mind that that's part of what it is that you need, part of payroll is PTO. And so, I think that, yes, you could do that. But I think the question may be getting to more than that, which is, how do we balance all these various different leaves that employees may have? We decide to pay them through the PPP money, to pay them through the PTO, the Families First Act, other sick leave, vacation, all these other things. And it really does need to be, or unemployment is another example. So there really does need to be an analysis each step of the way to figure out how it is that the mindset and how you came about determining why it is that you were paying an employee out of which bucket of money. So I think that's probably the best answer I can give to that.
Okay, thank you. Jim or Kate, I'm not sure who might be better prepared for responding to this. Quick question in terms of going back to the PPP loan being received. You started with a head count of 7 at your current state. An employee quit before the loan was received, but they were on your application. Now what?
So on the loan forgiveness application, thank goodness, they did actually put some safe harbors in place for employees that were either fired for cause, chose to leave, or retired. There are some safe harbors in place so that you're not getting docked for those situations that occurred. If somebody left and you rehired somebody else in their place, you don't really have to worry about it, but there is a specific safe harbor section that allows for those situations, which I was actually incredibly pleasantly surprised. I honestly didn't think they were going to be that forgiving. I thought it was going to be, it is what it is. Here are the numbers to use. So I was really happy to see that safe harbor was put in place. There is also a safe harbor. This was an interim rule that came out, I think, last week or the week before, because there is such an issue between unemployment and keeping people on payroll, that if you do make a good faith written offer to rehire one of your employees that you had previously let go and they are collecting unemployment now, and that employee chooses not to come back, that is also not going to be a dock against you. But you need to make sure that you have a written offer in place. You're going to need to substantiate that, and you're going to need to substantiate that they denied that offer. That moves into unemployment issues too, which is beyond my knowledge, but that there are safe harbors in place for employers for all of those things. Thank goodness. So.
Excellent. And we are unfortunately at our time, so I want to be respectful of that. If advisors are able to stay around, happy to allow for that as well, but know that we go from meeting to meeting, as I said, even in the virtual world. So I really do want to thank everyone for participating today, and particularly to thank Kate and Darian, Jim and Mindy and Melissa for sharing the information that you have as of this moment. And remind everyone that there are a lot of resources available. We have a collection available on the Timpano Consulting website and the COVID Center resource, which includes links to the advisors who are with us here today. And anything that any of the other advisors would like to share as your top level takeaway for people as you're moving forward. Darian, anything beyond? If you haven't applied, apply, and IFF is here for you.
That's right. I can't say it any better than that. And just take advantage of all the resources that that's being offered. So, to collectively, we can all get it together.
Excellent. Thank you. And Jim, takeaways from your perspective? I will continue to put that plug in for community banks and everything that you've been doing for the communities and strengthening that. Other takeaway?
You mentioned being patient earlier with this forgiveness process. I think that's a good takeaway. It's like filling out your taxes. If you open it up and look at it all at once, it can make you faint. But if you just take it step by step, it's all there. And yeah, love your accountants too.
And with that, Kate, as we love our accountants, I heard documentation as being a core component. What else would you encourage people to think through?
I think I just agree with everybody else to patience definitely is key, and also to hopefully take some of the anxiety out of, some of the loan programs. There are many things available, not just the PPP, and to make sure that you're exploring, what other potential options. There's a lot of money out there still. You just have to kind of figure out where to find it. So if the PPP doesn't feel right, know that there are some other avenues that you can go. So.
Melissa, you've been, one of the things I always take away when you're participating is the value of questions and listening to those answers and making sure you're connecting to the right resources. What else would you offer up for people?
I don't really have anything specific to add at this point. Welcome people to check out our website, and that we do have more resources there. We try to keep the Q&A updated, though this week's going to need a major rework. So anyway, and thank you, Melanie, for hosting these.
Absolutely. And Mindy, with hearing you ensuring that people are really remembering where their spheres of control are in all of this.
That's what I would say. The other thing is just reach out to your advisors. It's their job to know these answers. So reach out to them. Don't assume that you have to be the expert. That's why you have people like your accountants to know these things. The other thing, just a quick tip, I wouldn't be submitting those the forgiveness documentation until you absolutely have to. The rules are going to change probably one way or another, and I don't think they're going to get more restrictive. So you can't do any harm to just hold off and just wait until you absolutely have to submit them. I don't want to take your jobs away from you, Jim and Kate, but that's something that I've been telling people is don't rush. Just sit on it because things might get better.
Yep.
Agreed.
Good, solid advice. So thank you again to all the advisors. Thank you to all the participants. Go forward. If you don't have sunshine outside of your window, may you find something in your space that makes you smile. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.